If you're thinking about buying a property in 2025, the real estate market is in a really interesting phase. Both purchase prices and interest rates have fallen, but they seem to be on the rise again. So maybe now is the perfect time, or maybe it's not. In this video, we'll weigh the pros and cons of real estate for 2025. I'm Saidi from Finanztip. Have fun with it. One of the most important questions is, of course, how much property can you actually afford? And you can find that out best with our financing calculator. We'll link it for you up here or down in the video description. What speaks in favor of buying? One reason in favor of buying is that interest rates are still relatively low. Currently, when we are shooting this video, they are at around 3.3 to 3.4% on average. If you have optimal conditions, it can be a little less. And if your situation isn't so optimal, then you might have to pay a bit more. But that's how it is. Good 3%. That's relatively normal to even quite favorable in historical terms. Don't forget, especially if you hear from acquaintances or friends, we're only paying 1% or 2%. Yes, that was an absolute low interest phase a few years ago, historically almost unique. To put this in the right perspective for you, looking back at the past, mortgage rates of 4% or even 5% were not uncommon and sometimes even higher. What will be particularly exciting, of course, is how inflation will develop in the Eurozone and also in Germany. Because right now, when we shot this video, interest rates went up a bit because inflation went up again a bit. So we might be at a crossroads here, and it's possible that interest rates could rise a bit again. The next point in favor of buying is that the supply of housing, especially for landlords, is still relatively tight. This is especially true in the cities and the corresponding metropolitan areas. This is partly because the larger metropolitan areas are currently experiencing an influx of people. That means people are still moving from the countryside to the city, even though this trend has expanded a bit. Of course, due to Corona, people no longer have to live directly in the city because of more home office options, so they're also looking a bit further out. Furthermore, the fact is that housing construction hasn't really picked up in recent years under the current coalition government. The targets have been clearly missed, and the recent building permits have also been very low. And because building permits have an impact over many years, it can be assumed that housing construction will probably not go through the roof in the next few years, i.e. 2026, 2027. And all of this leads to the fact that rents, especially in cities, large cities and their surrounding areas, will continue to rise. How much exactly is certainly not yet determined, but it could also be that favorable financing for the respective landlords will expire in the coming years. That means they'll have to pay higher interest rates and will likely pass those costs onto the rents. And on top of that, property owners are constantly faced with the need for renovations. That means costs for energy-efficient renovations, which ultimately also affect the rents. What's particularly interesting are the purchase prices, both for apartments and for houses that you see here. This is the so-called house price index. There you see it. That initially, due to the change in interest rates and also as a consequence of the Ukraine war, property prices have fallen quite a bit. That has always been a warning shot. Yes, exactly. Property prices don't just move in one direction. They can also fall and have roughly dropped by about 10% on average. But what you can also see here is that in 2024, they picked up again, and they're calculating that this trend will likely continue. However, you can also see from the graph that they haven't massively increased. That means exactly what I said at the beginning. We are currently in a sort of transitional phase. Yes, prices are starting to rise again, but not dramatically. And all of this also leads to the statement from our real estate expert, Dirk Eilinghoff from Finanztip, that we have probably seen the lowest point in average purchase prices, and in other words, it's unlikely that prices will get any better. And another factor is that real wages in Germany are rising, inflation has gone down, and yet there are still wage increases in many sectors, especially as a result of the previously rising inflation. So right now, in many cases, wage increases are actually above the inflation rate, which is why real wages are rising. You obviously have to assess whether that applies to you, but this overall economic factor could also contribute to people at least feeling a bit more confident about getting into the real estate market. What speaks against buying a property in 2025? Everything we've just mentioned as pro arguments for real estate are very rational arguments. It was mostly about numbers. But buying a property is always a very emotional decision for you. And there are also some emotional reasons against it. And we're going to take a closer look at those now. And the biggest emotional factor, I see it in the area of uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty in the air right now, I would say, especially in economic terms. Maybe you're thinking about how secure your job is. The crisis in the automotive industry is probably already well known to all of you. And of course, many other industries are also connected to that. And also in many other industries, the economic situation isn't looking so bright right now. In Germany, and if you're thinking a bit about how secure your income is, can I really afford the mortgage payment, the financing rate? Then you might think about it once, twice, or even 3 times. And of course, that should also be a factor when you're putting together your calculations. Can you really afford the payment? This isn't just pulled out of thin air. And then there's another big factor of uncertainty. And of course, the question is, what will happen politically moving forward? Keyword: federal election and new federal government. What will a new federal government actually decide in terms of taxes? Will this be to your advantage or disadvantage? What kind of funding will there be for future property owners, especially when it comes to the topic of renovations? What will the funding for various energy renovations look like in the future? The heating law is definitely up for debate. That could be positive for you, but also negative. You might be noticing right now that this emotional factor of uncertainty can be interpreted in 2 ways. You can either say, oh yes, everything looks pretty uncertain for me in terms of the future. I'm going to hold off on the property plan until I know more about my job situation and until I know what I can expect from the government. But you can also see it the other way around. You can also argue, so many people are feeling uncertain right now, but I'm not. And that's exactly why the plan could be interesting right now. Because if so many people are feeling uncertain and putting their property plans on hold for now, then prices might not rise as much as one would actually fear. In other words, you could say, yes, especially because of the uncertainty, I can now buy at relatively low prices. And this plan is also not to be dismissed. It always depends, of course, whether this applies to the specific property in the specific location that you're actually interested in, whether you're actually buying it, so to speak, at a bargain price or buying it at this moment, even though it should actually be rising more strongly in the near future if the demand were higher. If the property is actually attractive and the demand should be higher, but for some reason, it just isn't right now. What also argues against buying, or at least against the idea that you need to buy urgently right now, is that the price increases. As you saw earlier in the graph, the situation with real estate isn't that dramatic right now. In other words, the prices aren't really skyrocketing or running away from you. The risk is relatively low. In general, you can expect price increases of between 1 to maybe 4% in 2025. And this is especially true again in the big cities and urban areas. In rural areas, it's a completely different story. People tend to want to move away from there, or to be honest, they are also dying off. And there, you really need to pay close attention to what you might be buying there. Whether you should maybe even wait because it might get cheaper, or you should even consider whether you should go there at all. Why? Because prices can indeed also decrease in the long term. For a similar reason, the price increases in the big cities might not be that significant. Why? Just now, what we mentioned earlier, the migration of families from the big cities to the surrounding areas, especially because of home office and all that. Of course, there are also counter movements in companies like back to the office, where people are going to the office more often and moving closer to the big cities. But of course, this takes away some of the price pressure in the big cities from working from home. Another argument against buying, or at least against the urgent pressure to buy, is that the influx into Germany isn't particularly strong. Our population is hardly growing. In the first half of 2024, there were just 40,000 more people in all of Germany. That was the lowest population growth in the last 10 years. Of course, nobody knows how this will continue, what impact any refugee movements might have in the future. But the long-term trend in an aging population is that there will no longer be as much need for living space in Germany as there is in the area. That can definitely look very different locally, depending on where you're interested in a property. Another point that makes you think about buying or building is definitely the topic of energy-efficient renovation. Especially if you are interested in an older property, the corresponding renovation costs continue to rise. Simply put, because the craftsmen are more expensive and the material costs have gone up. Speaking of inflation, it's definitely having a significant impact because, as we've already mentioned, you might not be entirely sure what kind of government support you'll receive, and because you might also be concerned about your loan. You'll incur interest surcharges if you buy an older building that isn't at least optimally renovated. Our real estate expert Dirk assesses the situation as follows. It's really an incredibly interesting time, and the general interest in real estate is expected to pick up in the first half of 2025, but he expects that not many people will actually take action, especially because of the uncertainty factors that are currently present, namely the issues of the economy and politics. In the second half of 2025, things could look different, especially if both topics develop positively, meaning if the economy improves and it's clear what kind of support and tax conditions you can expect from the government, What does that mean for you specifically? So it is quite clear that if you're used to thinking about real estate, then now is definitely the right time to get involved. Because ultimately, as always, it is a question, as we have already said, of the concrete object in the concrete situation, which factors apply to you, whether you should jump in now or wait a bit longer until there's more certainty. And in the end, it's also a question of your risk tolerance, whether you say, I'm willing to accept these uncertainty factors because I believe that it will ultimately turn out positively. It affects my purchase price, the interest I will pay, and so on. And you can also see from this that, of course, every property, whether for your own home or for renting, is always an investment that comes with a certain level of risk. And that's why we often say that real estate can be a good retirement plan for you, a good investment as long as you buy the right property. But they are not risk-free. And there's always the alternative of taking your equity, your money, and investing it globally in stock ETFs, which is a fundamentally simpler option. Both options are certainly risky, and it's not accurate to say that real estate is always safer than the alternative, which is investing in stock ETFs. Now, a brief overview of the political reform proposals that are on the table, which will of course also affect a new federal government. Let me summarize that. One aspect is that things should be faster and easier. Keyword, reducing bureaucracy through digitalization. This can include funding applications. This means that they should be made simpler and more digital, or specifically building applications, so that you don't have to wait so long for the corresponding approval from the municipality. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of the corresponding requirements regarding energy efficient renovations, that it shouldn't be regulated by such rigid rules, but rather be managed more flexibly through simple incentives so that you have a bit more freedom. Another topic is the property transfer tax. Yes, when you buy a property, the additional costs already make up a large portion, and the question is, can't it be lowered or even completely eliminated? For example, Miriam Moore from Interhub said, why don't we do it in the Netherlands? For example, people under 35 don't have to pay any property transfer tax when they buy their first property. And in this context, you can also take a look at a current funding program like the program Young Buys Old, which supports young families when they buy an old building. What problems are there? Within a certain time frame, an old building must be brought up to a fairly high energy renovation standard, namely the EH70 standard. And that costs quite a bit because, as we just mentioned, the costs for such a significant energy renovation have indeed increased accordingly. And the second problem is that the corresponding income limits are set too low. Families can only get a favorable loan if their taxable income is 90,000 euros plus 10,000 euros for each additional child. And those are indeed income limits that probably only apply to properties, let's say, not near the converted big cities, which ultimately excludes many families from these desirable regions de facto, at least from this program. Those were just a few highlights of what's coming up in the next few months, especially under a new government regarding building and housing. There are likely to be discussion points that will probably interest you quite a bit. So you've seen there are quite a few arguments for it and quite a few against it. Again, now is certainly the right time to think about it. Whether now is the right time for you to make a move, ultimately no one can tell you that. That always depends on your specific property. What do you think about it? Are you guys in the right place right now? How is your decision possibly shaping up right now? Let's get involved in that as well. And write that in the YouTube comments. I hope our pros and cons have given you a bit of clarity and helped you with your decision. If that's the case, then please give me a like for that. That's it for today. Feel free to use our financing calculator if you want to get a bit more clarity on your budget. Until the next video, your Saidi.